It's become clear since Inauguration Day that Donald Trump is on a mission to destroy the American public's faith in the idea of objective reality, the idea that reality exists and it's knowable, that you can learn about it through journalistic inquiry or the scientific method, that you can poll things, do experiments, find out about the world that you live in and what people think about that world. He's not a fan of that, and that is in no place more obvious than in how he treats critical polls. Now, let's talk about these polls, because they haven't been kind to him recently. A CNN ORC International poll released on Friday found Mr. Trump had the lowest approval rating of any new president at 44%. But maybe that's just one. Well, another survey carried out over the weekend by Gallup put his approval rating even lower at 42%. His disapproval rating also jumped from 50% to 53%, perhaps related to the constant protests against him. I honestly don't know. Now, you might think, well, we're a partisan society. We're split between the parties. Maybe this is just the way things go. But historically, that's not the case. By comparison, Barack Obama polled around 76% after his first 2 weeks in charge, the highest of any recent president, while George W. Bush was at 58%, and Bill Clinton achieved 59%. So this is actually historically odd or noteworthy. And so you might think, in light of that, since you came into the presidency having lost the popular vote by almost 3 million votes, you're incredibly unpopular, there's been huge nationwide protests against your policies, that maybe there would be some self-reflection, some analysis, and perhaps a recharting of your course, but I wouldn't expect it, because he also polled this over the weekend. Any negative polls are fake news, just like the CNN, ABC, NBC polls in the election. Sorry, people want border security and extreme vetting. Any negative polls are fake news, which is amazing. Amazing to me. We know that that's his strategy, to make people not trust these things, but he just said it in a couple of words.
I know.
Here is what I want you to believe. Please believe it.
So let me just address a small point before I get into the larger issue here. So it's actually true that polls do indicate that the majority of Americans, or at least a sizable chunk of Americans, do want extreme vetting and to secure the borders, right? So there's
don't seem to know that we already have it.
Right, exactly. So there seems to be this interesting disconnect between his approval ratings and the way people feel about some of his policies, right? So maybe a specific policy is somewhat popular, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he's doing well with his approval rating. Now, with that said, can you imagine living your life the way Donald Trump does, where every time you see something, a fact, a figure, a quote, an opinion that you don't like, you just automatically reject it as something that's fake and has no legitimacy whatsoever. So like this morning, I weighed myself, I gained 10 pounds. That's a fake scale. Okay, the scale is against me. Fake news. Smash it, right? Oh, but the other day I weighed myself and it said I lost 5 pounds. No, that scale's cool. Isn't it interesting how anything that disagrees with him is fake news, but anything that does agree with him, he's got to prop it up. You know, this is a great guy. This is a great journalist. This is a great whatever. Anything that opposes him, no. Yeah. Fake news.
And it's amazing how quickly and how readily his supporters have accepted these sorts of arguments.
Yeah.
I mean, first of all, if you think that he's being honest about polls and whether he trusts them or not, just ask yourself. Back during the primaries, did he like the polls then? Yes, you know that he liked the polls. He tweeted about them hundreds and hundreds of times. But to not think, and look, his supporters have attacked me whenever I talk about polls, saying, well, in the general election, the polls were wrong and you guys got embarrassed. Okay, the polls largely weren't wrong. The national polls showed that Hillary Clinton was likely to win by a couple of points. Well, she won by a couple of points. It didn't seem to matter because our democracy doesn't work that way, but she did actually win by almost 3 million votes. And yes, the state polls were a little bit off. That's what happens with polls. Polls aren't intended to be an exact idea of what's going to happen. They have confidence intervals. If you actually study polls, as I was forced to in graduate school, you learn about these things. But for them, polls are only accurate until they're wrong once. And then you never have to trust them anymore. And you certainly don't have to trust them if they're critical of the policies that you support.
It's not just polls. Everything is accurate until it proves them wrong, right? So, or if they don't like it. Like, I did my taxes and I owe the government some money, but you know what? I think that accountant is a fake accountant. Like, fake news. I don't like it, so I'm going to reject it.
Why did that accountant go rogue?
He went rogue. I don't know. I guess I gotta.
Sad.
Yeah, I just gotta go to other accountants. Maybe one that will lead to an insane audit later on. But regardless, I need people to think logically and critically about some of the things that Donald Trump says. I don't know how many Donald Trump supporters are watching this show right now, but if you are watching, just think about how you would feel if the tables were turned. First of all, I would be livid even if it was a Democratic president. If a Democratic president decides to completely ignore any and all criticism or any indication that the American public disagrees with him, I would be mad. I'd be like, this person is not interested in representing the American people. And the same treatment should be extended to someone like Donald Trump.
Yeah. So I want to lay out, though, 2 reasons why I think this matters. Because you might think, well, you guys are just overly focusing on the polls. Why are you getting so wrapped up in this? And you're focusing on one of his tweets. It's probably just a squirrel. Why are you bothered by it? We're going to turn to that in just 1 second. But also, this next tweet, which we're going to show you, is just proof that he is seeing the criticisms of him in 2 different areas. So this tweet says, I call my own shots largely based on an accumulation of data, and everyone knows it. Some fake news media in order to marginalize lies.
I love the capitalization of fake news.
So there's 2 things there. He's criticized as being an incurious fellow, I'll say. And that's why he throws in that thing about largely based on an accumulation of data. Even he can't claim it's all based on the data. But he also says, I call my own shots, which tells me that he has seen the criticism of how he appears to be being controlled by Steve Bannon. We're not going to talk about it at length on the show, but it came out over the weekend that he apparently didn't understand the executive order that he signed that put Steve Bannon on one of the councils of the National Security Council.
Oh my God.
And he was apparently angry about it. And then you have the SNL skit about him going to the child's table while Steve Bannon sits at the White House desk. I think that he's seeing those. Yeah. But here's why all of this matters, okay? Whether he's popular or not, whether his policies are popular or not, there's 2 reasons. One focused on Trump and one focused on the public. So in the past, presidents do unpopular things, and almost inevitably, by the time they leave office, aside from Barack Obama, they tend to be pretty unpopular. Clinton held it in there for a long time. But they tend to be unpopular because they've done a lot of things and it angers people. But when they do something that's incredibly unpopular, presidents on both sides of the aisle have shown that they can respond based on that. So after Katrina, after the attempt to privatize Medicare under George W. Bush, he did actually back off from that. He did change his policies in some ways, and you can find examples of that under Clinton and certainly if you go back farther than that. And they can show that they care and that they want to win. But he doesn't trust any of that. And so can we trust that in the next 4 years, if he sinks down to 30%, to 20%, will he ever shift from his extreme positions? Like other presidents have? Perhaps not. But whether he changes or not, it also matters what people perceive to be reality when it comes to these policies. So as Anna pointed out, some of his policies are popular. And look, largely, if you ask Trump voters, do you approve of his presidency, they say that they do. Now, when you break it down into individual policies, that's not exactly the way it goes. Now, the Muslim travel ban, depending on how you word it, you can get 50% of the public to say that they support it. When you're very explicit about what it does, that tends to drop, as we mentioned a few minutes ago. But from terrorism and immigration to healthcare and foreign affairs, a majority say that they disapprove of his administration's policies. Half of respondents said that the Muslim ban harmed American values and would make the country less safe from terrorism. And here's why that matters. Because that's what actually happens when you poll the American public. You can find out what they actually think. But what do they think about what the American public thinks? That matters too. And if they trust Donald Trump, they will believe that all these polls can't be trusted and that he's very popular. He has huge crowds at his inauguration and everybody supports what he's doing. And that matters. There's this concept of something called an unpopular norm. An unpopular norm exists when people perceive a view or behavior to have popular support when it's actually opposed by the majority. Examples range from undergraduates overestimating the popularity of binge drinking on college campuses to citizens within repressive regimes underestimating the dissatisfaction of their peers. And experiments have shown that unpopular norms affect people's behaviors. College students who believe that binge drinking is more popular than it is will actually end up drinking more. Citizens in repressive regimes who think that their peers support the regime will not oppose it. And so there is a battle, an extremely important battle over public opinion and what actually constitutes public opinion. Right now, people are protesting every weekend against Donald Trump. But if they start to believe falsely that he is popular and his policies have popular approval, then they might start to become apathetic and they might start to dissociate a bit from popular political activism.
So I have a lot to say about this, and I'll try to condense it into a shorter response. During the election, one of the things that really confused me was how many people rejected data, right? I'm talking about unbiased scientific data, and it just pure information, straight news reporting on the issues. And if individuals didn't like that information, they just didn't trust it. They just rejected it, kind of similar to, you know, what Trump is doing. And so one of the things that you heard time and time again was, oh, people who are criticizing Trump and giving me this data that goes against what he says are just elitists, right? They're just elitists. They're just elitists. They're pushing
Ivory
this
Tower academics.
Exactly. They're pushing this elitist narrative. Okay, well, how do we convince those individuals to listen to credible sources again? How do you convince those individuals that no, the person who has conned you is not, you know, I don't know, Amy Goodman from
From Democracy Now?
Yeah, from Democracy Now! Random choice, right? Just because she's a pretty
very credible.
She's very credible, exactly. The person who's conning you is Donald Trump. So how do you convince them to do it? And I've kind of come to the realization that the only time that you can finally convince some of Trump's staunch supporters is when they start feeling the economic burden of what Trump is going to do.
Yeah.
You know, because look, if he follows through on taxing Mexican imports at 22%, okay, that would be a disaster, okay? That would be a disaster for various corporations here in the United States that rely on parts made in Mexico. It would be a disaster for, you know, our food prices. Inflation would go through the roof. I mean, every economist who's looked at that said, no, that's a terrible idea, don't do it. So if he actually does follow through on policies like that, and we can kind of see he's crazy and he does follow through on things he says he's gonna do, well, people are gonna feel it. And I think at that point, maybe they'll wake up and realize, hey, this guy is not here to represent your best interests. He's here to represent his own best interests.
Yeah. Well, and I think you also sort of demonstrated that last week. You did the story of was it a Syrian woman?
Right. Oh, that's a perfect example. So a Syrian woman who's actually Christian voted for Donald Trump, and then he does this travel ban, and her family members who are actually in Damascus as the travel ban was issued tried to come back to the United States, and they have visas, but they got rejected and they got deported back to Damascus. And she was outraged by it. She's like, no, I get it. Like, we're trying to keep the country safe, but I didn't know this was gonna affect me in a bad way. And so I don't want people to be affected in a bad way, but I do want people to really hone in on what his policy ideas are and how it will impact a lot of people negatively, including themselves.
Are you sick of the mainstream media? Then I got good news for you. We're going to hire some investigative reporters and we're going to go house. We're actually going to investigate what's happening in this country and stand up for you guys. Help us do it. Go to tytnetwork.com/go. If everybody watching this video just gives a little bit of money, we'd have plenty to hire those investigative teams and unleash them on the country.